Hey guys, it's M, and today we're going to be targeting another fan favorite. I know some people may be wondering why Southern Borgia got dedicated videos, and I just never did any videos like that afterwards. It's not because I didn't want to, just with everything else I had going on. All those other script ideas got shoved so far back, it took until this year. So to kick off that list, why not start by pissing on the other blonde Nanto fella shit, the first real villain of HNK, our starting point in the story, and technically the one who sets many major plot points into motion. How is this character handled in the original manga? In thought, he's a great concept. He's the opposite of Ken. Instead of using Hokuto, he uses Nanto. Instead of kindness being his motivation, it's obsession. He's kind of similar to Rao in a way, trying to brute force something that isn't his. But unlike Rao, who wanted everything, Shin simply wanted Yuri. And it was his obsession that led to her leaping from his tower in an attempt to end things. A man who finally ran into the one thing he couldn't control, someone's heart. See, this sounds beautiful and poetic when I bring it up like this, right? The problem is the piss poor execution in the base story. First, he got really hoed by pacing. Ken's dogging Shin's men for like 10 or so chapters with us getting little glimpses of him here and there, which really helped hype him up and make us fear this guy. But when we reach Ken's actual encounter with him, Ken fucking ragdolls immediately and dies. I partially understand why from a writing standpoint you'd want to do this, to show how far Ken's grown from the initial flashback we saw. But since we've never seen Shin fight anyone else, we run into the same problem SNK had, as we don't really know how strong he's meant to be because we got nothing to base it off of. And seeing how Ken somewhat struggles with literally every other Nanto master in the entire series, it makes Shin look like a Gerber baby by comparison. Then there's the aspect of him being the opposite to Ken. When you have a character like this who's the direct opposite of your main character, I feel it just makes sense for us to see them in their element for at least a little bit. You know, kind of like how it's handled in most other pieces of fiction using this kind of character. And later here with Rao, that makes for all the promise Shin has as a character get tossed out the window immediately with how fast he dies. Even when he's with Yuri and they say he's been ruthlessly expanding his empire because of his obsession and to impress her, it's relegated to only like 5 or so panels. Imagine if while Ken's exploring with Bat and Rin, 2 kids he saved due to his kindness, we immediately hard cut to Shin slaughtering innocents with his ugly and insane army of degenerates, giving us an amazing build-up for when these two eventually fight. Then, when Shin's dying and says he drove Yuri to the point that he did, we would have seen all that play out with our own eyes right before Ken got there. This would have been infinitely better than, fuck, let's just fill it in with a few panels. Another, though admittedly small issue I have with Shin is that he's the star of the martyr, as he lived and died for the belief of loving Yuri. And he was the martyr that supposedly had to die for the plot to advance, which is how I personally took it. I'ma say it straight. The star of the martyr doesn't fit this character at all for me. Perhaps in his movie interpretation where he dies trying to protect Yuri and helps Kenshiro along his path, but in the main story, the main theme of his character is obsession. Everything he suffers through is due to his inability to let go. Even in the later reveals about this guy, which we'll talk about in a bit, all of them nail in the fact that all his faults come from his obsession. So why not make that his star? Honestly, if you ask me to think of anyone in the series as a martyr, I'd probably say Shu. You know, the man who literally blinded himself and suffered fighting for the freedom of his people against Souther, and who ultimately ended up dying for that cause. In the end, this is a small aspect, but it really annoys me thinking back on it. Then let's talk about the later revelations of this character, as it seemed Hara wanted to get a little bit more mileage out of him in the coming arcs. In the Jaggy arc, we're shown that Jaggy egged Shin into attacking Ken at the start of the story. It doesn't give us a ton, but it shows how much he can't let go, playing into the obsession aspect of his character, alongside going a bit into how little he seemingly thought of Kenshiro at the time. Some people say this downplays how much of an asshole Shin was. It adds a new spin to the character, since Jaggy was the one who talked him into it. But not really. Jaggy didn't do anything other than talk to his insecurities. That's really one of the things I frankly didn't like about this chapter. How they tried to frame it as if Jaggy forced Shin into this, and like it's not really all his fault. Like Shin's a little baby unable to make his own choices. When if Shin simply said no, the entire start of this story would not have happened. This would have been a way more impactful development if, like I said before, we were more well versed when it came to this character. But since he's a bozo Ken dogged within 5 minutes, it carries some weight, but it doesn't feel like an earth-shattering revelation or anything. It really just comes across as, oh no, you're telling me that the dude we saw murdering people left and right and slaughtering innocents to prove a point had a 5-second conversation with another asshole and that convinced him? I guess he's free of all charges. Then we reach the second reveal, which is when Yuria jumped, the chariot saved her, and Shin allowed them to take her away to keep her safe from Rao. This is probably one of the best story reveals in late HNK 1, and it does a lot for this character. When he rushes down, he's in tears, saying that if she lives, that'd be enough for him. He even seems like he was about to compromise in his next line before he was cut off. When he begins talking to the chariots and they explain how they saved her, he still doesn't want to give her up until Raoh is mentioned. And with 2 panels with no words in them, we see Shin seem to accept that Yuria won't accept him in Ken's place, to which he hands her off, saying he'll act like Yuria's killer to protect her from Raoh's forces, and that one day in the future, he himself or Ken will come for her, so the chariots better keep her safe. You may be wondering why I low-key just read back something to you that I'm pretty sure you've already read, but honestly, it's because the scene was so good it felt like I had to refresh you on it. I don't know how many Shin fans there are, but I can almost guarantee you a good chunk of them came from this scene. I've always thought that the Chariots arc was peak HNK1 writing, and this is one of the examples of that. It shows Shin didn't fully change, as even after she almost ended her life to get away from him, he still wanted to be the one that guarded her. It wasn't until Raoh's mentioned, a character that would have dogged him pretty easily at this point, does he have to pause and think about it, which is honestly a little funny to me, because that'd be like if Hezbollah had to stop and think if he could protect someone from prime Mike Tyson. But anyways, even after all that, he says that one day Ken or himself will come after Yuria, showing that even still, he hadn't fully given up on her. I like this because it's not a radical 180. He still acts like his selfish and arrogant self, as after all he did to Ken practically unprompted, he still just can't accept the world where Yuria loves Ken. Which is why even after all this, he still wants to fight Ken to the death, despite the fact that if they worked together and he put aside his feelings for her, they both most likely could have survived to save her from Raoh. He's only partially willing to compromise for her safety. They managed to give him a nice bit of character growth and not shy away from his selfish obsession aspect. This also recontextualizes a bit of Shin's death dialogue in the first 10 chapters, which makes it go from simply lamenting Yuria's death to him grieving the fact he couldn't ever win her over, and that he won't be the one to go to the chariots to get with her. It's a great segment that fleshes out his character quite a bit, but since he died so long ago, past this point, he won't ever be mentioned again. In conclusion, Shin is an interesting character. At face value, he seems pretty one note, but the further you go into the story, he has quite a bit going on. His main issue is, like many others, how fast they dealt with it. Had he stuck around for at least a bit longer, I'm sure many more would like him. But due to his quick death and how far apart those 2 reveal scenes happen to be from each other, many think of him as one of the weaker HNK villains, if not just a footnote in the plot. This leads us to the question I like to ask at the end of all these videos. How would we fix Shin? Honestly, I don't think there's that much to fix. He's kinda like Souther in that regard, though I personally think executed just a smidgen better. Going back into this for a second, for Souther, I wanted to see literally any more of his youth. It was the only part of his story that made him feel like a human, and his connection with Ogai as a child was a major character point for him, but we barely got to see any of it. So we were stuck with one-note heartless villain Souther, who was a cool wall-type enemy for Kenshiro, and since he was an actual threat, he could kinda get away with that. But for me, that was when the character was at his least interesting. For Shin, I feel I got all the backstory I wanted from him, but by the time you find out how interesting he wasn't alive to capitalize on that interest. And while the revelation of him letting Yuria go does make it fun to look back at the first 10 chapters, the only thing you can really recontextualize is what I mentioned earlier, his death. As even in the short time he had alive before him and Ken fought, we didn't get to see him in his element, as we were far too busy focusing on Spade Heart clubbing the goons. So I guess the only thing I'd really add is some chapters towards the start where Shin's out conquering land with his army, us watching him kill and plunder with his own hands, with him perhaps slowly getting disturbed with himself, or just seeming apathetic about it instead of his iconic laughter, knowing these were the kind of activities he did to scare Yuria away, or just let us see small interactions between him with the townfolk he's conquering. So when we get that big reveal later on, it gives us a lot more to rethink about when revisiting the start of the story. Anyways, I think that's all my thoughts about Shin. What do you guys think? Do you like Shin, or do you see some other sort of way you could fix him? Or do you think he's an irredeemable shit character? As always, as long as you're respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you guys in the comments. And with that, I've been out, and I am out.